That autumn morning, the Ashmont University campus looked like a postcard. The trees in front of the Social Sciences building formed a corridor of reddish and golden leaves, and the cool air carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee and damp paper. Hurried students crossed the large central square, some with headphones, others clutching stacks of books, all immersed in their own haste. Amidst this scene, one figure attracted less attention than it deserved. The young professor walking alone, clutching a blue folder to her chest. Emily Carter was 29 years old, with brown hair pulled back in a simple bun and thin-rimmed glasses that insisted on slipping when she got nervous. She wore a navy blue blazer that still smelled new, black dress pants, and shoes that, although understated, still ached a little in the long hallways. It was her first semester as a full-time professor at the university, and even after a few weeks, that feeling of being an outsider hadn't gone away. She pushed open the door to the sociology department and felt the contrast between the silence of the hallway and the murmur coming from the faculty lounge. Muffled voices, laughter, cups clinking on saucers. Emily took a deep breath, forced a polite smile, and went inside. In the room, 3 older professors were gathered near the coffee table. Professor Harris, with his white hair combed back, was telling a story. Next to him, Professor Miller was fiddling with her cell phone while laughing, and Professor Klein was distractedly leafing through a folded newspaper. As soon as Emily entered, Harris looked up, observed her from head to toe, and smiled with that air of someone about to crack a joke. "Good morning," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Good morning, Professor Carter," Harris replied, in an almost overly formal tone that betrayed irony. "Ready to save the American education system today?" Miller laughed, making no attempt to hide it. "I think she already saved it," Harris, Miller commented. "Didn't you see yesterday's email? The Prodigy professor is going to present her groundbreaking research on student inequality to the state committee, but nobody invited the rest of us." The way she said prodigy teacher made Emily's stomach churn. Klein glanced quickly at Emily, raised an eyebrow, and returned to the newspaper as if it were all a charade he was already used to. Emily forced a smile. "That's not quite right. It was just an invitation to present preliminary results. It's nothing that big of a deal." "Come on, don't be modest," Harris teased. "After all, it's not every day that the state decides to listen to someone who's barely finished their doctorate. It must be the power of social media. Students love it, don't they? Short videos, impactful phrases, that kind of thing." Miller added, "And age helps. It's easier to connect with students when you're about the same age as them. We've been past that stage a long time ago." Emily pretended not to hear the last sentence. She walked to the small counter, poured coffee, trying not to let the little spoon tremble, and returned to her desk. The teacher's lounge had a row of individual desks against the wall, each with a nameplate bearing the name of its occupant. Hers was the newest, still gleaming, Professor Emily Carter. Below the name, someone had stuck a small sticker with a drawing of an apple and the phrase, "Good luck, newbie." Emily never found out who had stuck it there, but she had learned to live with the ambiguous gesture, half friendly, half condescending. She sat down, turned on her laptop, and opened the slides for the presentation she would give in a few hours. The title, in simple letters, occupied the initial screen: "The Invisible Voice, Low-Income Students in Elite Universities." The research was the result of years of interviews, visits to public schools, conversations with families who could barely pay the bills, and sleepless nights in the library. Emily knew by name several of the young people whose stories appeared in the graphs and tables. For her, they weren't statistics. They were faces. They were voices. While she reviewed each topic, the conversation behind her continued. "I just don't understand how such a new study caught the committee's attention," Miller said. "We've been working on this for decades. I myself have published several articles on educational inequality. But suddenly, this is the study that gets called upon. It's just that people want something new now, Miller," Klein replied without taking his eyes off the news. "Young faces. It's the trend. It has nothing to do with meritocracy. It's marketing." Harris gave a short laugh. "Perhaps the state wants a good story for the press. Young teacher brings a new perspective. That sounds good in the newspapers." Emily felt her face grow hot. It wasn't just the envy disguised in their words. It was the way they reduced everything she had done to a mere image win, as if years of effort were an irrelevant detail compared to her age. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and mentally repeated what she always told herself. You're not here by chance. You know what you're doing. The first class of the day went well. The sociology of education class seemed more interested than in previous weeks. Some students had already heard about the presentation she would be giving, mainly because a student blog had published a short interview with her the day before. Emily walked around the room, asked questions, listened to answers, and wrote arguments on the board. There, in front of the students, the weight of her classmates' criticism seemed less. After class, a student approached, still with her backpack on her back. Professor Carter, may I say something? Sure, Ashley, go ahead. I read the interview on the blog. I'm also the first in my family to come to university. When you talked about feeling out of place in the first semester, it seemed like you were telling my story. Thank you for not pretending that everything was always easy. Emily felt her heart soften a little. I'm glad you identified with this. You're not alone in this. And that's precisely why this research is important. Ashley smiled, waved, and left. Emily stood there for a few seconds, staring at the door that had just closed. It was moments like these that reminded her why she persisted, even when the atmosphere became hostile. Mid-morning, the building's clock announced, with its deep tone, that there were only a few minutes left before the internal presentation that would precede the meeting with the state committee. Before being seen by outside authorities, Emily's research had to be officially presented to the department itself, as was protocol. The meeting would take place in the large seminar room on the second floor. Emily walked over with her blue briefcase under her arm. Upon opening the door, she saw that almost all the seats were filled, full professors, veteran researchers, a few doctoral students. At the back of the room, two representatives from the university administration whispered, adjusting their name tags. In the corner, a projector was already on, waiting for the presentation. Harris sat in the front row, arms crossed, expressionless. Miller and Klein occupied seats right next to him. There was something in the silence of the room that wasn't exactly hostility, but it wasn't exactly welcoming either. It was the cold curiosity of someone wanting to see if anyone will stumble. The department head, Professor Whitman, stood up when he saw her. Good morning, everyone. Today we will have a presentation by Professor Emily Carter, who, as you know, has been conducting research on low-income students and their access to higher education. He paused briefly. This presentation is important, not only because of the topic, but also because the results were considered relevant enough to be heard by the State Education Policy Committee. So, Professor Carter, the floor is yours. Emily nodded, connected the laptop to the projector, and for a moment, the room was illuminated by the blue light of the start screen. She took a deep breath and began. Good morning. Thank you for being here. Her voice came out a little higher pitched than usual, but she continued. The Invisible Voice Project was born from the personal experience of growing up in a low-income family in a small town in rural Ohio, and arriving at a campus like this, where most of the students came from completely different backgrounds. Some glances turned up at the mention of her own experience. Emily knew that some there would turn up their noses, saying it was too confessional, but it didn't matter. For her, that was the core of her research. She showed graphs, tables, and statistical maps with distinct colors indicating the neighborhoods of origin of the students. She spoke about the interview, displaying quotes from young people who said they were ashamed of their address, who hid the fact that they had 2 jobs, who avoided mentioning that they shared a room with 3 siblings. As she progressed, some faces in the audience changed. There was less irony, more seriousness. But when he got to the boldest part of the research, the proposal for a new model of cooperation between universities and public schools, based not on generic programs, but on specific mentors, psychological support, and scholarship. Adapted to each student's reality, he noticed expressions of skepticism resurfacing. Harris raised her hand even before she finished the slide. Professor Carter, she interrupted, leaning forward. Excuse me, but that seems a bit too idealistic, don't you think? individual mentors, psychological support, customized scholarships. We're talking about an entire state. Where would the money for that come from? Some people laughed discreetly. Emily felt the criticism like a sting, but maintained a respectful tone. I understand the concern, Professor Harris. The model I am proposing is not intended to be implemented immediately and completely in all institutions. It was conceived as a pilot project, starting with a small group of selected universities and schools. Furthermore, some of the resources could come from partnerships with private foundations that already allocate funds to educational programs, but which often lack sufficient data to know where to invest with the greatest impact. Miller commented, making no secret of the provocative tone. So the idea is for private entities to finance inequalities that the state can't solve? Isn't it a little dangerous to rely so much on private initiatives? It's not about replacing the role of the state, Emily replied, but about recognizing that the most efficient solutions usually emerge when various actors work together, with clear data and specific goals. What the research shows is that, as things stand, many people manage to get into university, but they can't stay. That's where the model fails. Whitman glanced at his watch, assessing the rising tension. Let's leave the questions for the end. Continue, Professor Carter. Emily concluded her presentation with a case study. She told the story of a fictional student, a synthesis of several real interviewees. Michael, the son of a single mother who worked 2 jobs, the first in his family to get into a prestigious university. She showed how, with adequate support in high school, continuous mentoring, and a well-structured scholarship, his chances of staying in the program increased dramatically. When it was over, the room fell silent for a few seconds. Then, scattered applause could be heard. Some was sincere, others seemed to be merely fulfilling a social protocol. Whitman thanked them, and the questions began. There were technical questions, doubts about sampling, criticisms of the number of institutions analyzed. Emily answered one calmly, but however hard she tried, she could feel a kind of invisible barrier. It wasn't a purely academic discussion. There was something personal there, a resistance to the idea that someone so young could propose structural changes. Finally, as the teachers dispersed, Harris approached, putting his glasses in his pocket. You know, Professor Carter, please don't take offense at my tone. It's just that ... We've seen many grand proposals that never got off the ground. Experience makes one suspicious. I understand, Emily replied, but someone needs to keep trying. Even if some proposals don't work, others can pave the way for real change. Perhaps, he murmured with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. Anyway, good luck this afternoon with the committee. They love new ideas. Until they get tired of them. He walked away, leaving a trail of doubt in the air. Miller and Klein passed by, talking quietly, and Emily would swear she heard her name in the middle of a sentence, and a short laugh right after. Alone in the room, she gathered her laptop, her briefcase, her water bottle. For a moment, she thought about the nights she almost gave up on her doctorate, when she felt that no one took her seriously because she was too young and too emotional. She thought of her mother, who worked at a supermarket in rural Ohio, and who always said, between overtime shifts, if you got in there, it's because you belong there. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. In the afternoon, the atmosphere at the university changed. Official cars began to appear in the parking lot near the main building. People with different name tags circulated through the hallways. The State Education Policy Committee was coming for a series of meetings, and Emily's presentation would be one of the last of the day. In the hallway on the 3rd floor, where the auditorium reserved for the meeting was located, some employees were adjusting chairs, testing the sound system, and placing bottles of water on a side table. Emily waited, leaning against the wall, gripping her folder so tightly that her fingers began to ache. The university's president, Dr. Allen, approached with a rehearsed smile. Professor Carter, are you ready for the big moment? Ready? I don't know, but I'm here, she replied, trying to sound lighthearted. Your research has attracted a lot of attention. I've received calls from people who had never shown any interest in sociology before. It seems the committee is genuinely curious. Curious, ... she repeated, unsure whether that was a good or bad thing. Before Allen could respond, an assistant in a dark suit approached. Dr. Allen, they're arriving. The security personnel are already at the main entrance. Emily felt her heart race. She knew that among those present would be the state's education minister, a man known for his pragmatic approach and direct language, someone who, in the news, appeared more often alongside budget charts than alongside students. The auditorium gradually filled up. Government representatives, school principals, invited journalists, a few teachers. In the middle row, Emily could see Harris, Miller, and Klein side by side whispering something while observing the stage. It was clear they weren't expecting much from her. Some seemed to have come just to see what would happen. The Master of Ceremonies briefly presented the program, highlighted the importance of bridging the gap between academic, research, and public policy, and finally announced, "And now, to conclude our series of presentations, we invite Professor Emily Carter from Ashmont University to share the results of her research, The Invisible Voice, Low-Income Students at Elite University, and a proposed model for cooperation between public schools and higher education institutions." Emily stepped onto the stage, feeling the footsteps echo in the silence of the auditorium. The projector light illuminated the screen once more. She glanced at the audience for a moment. She saw attentive faces, some bored, others impassive. In the front row, the state's education minister, Robert Whitfield, watched her with a neutral expression, his hands crossed on his knee. She cleared her throat and began to speak. The first few minutes dragged on, not because she was insecure, but because the weight of the atmosphere made each word more dense. Still, as she progressed, something changed. When she showed the map with the concentration of low-income students from a few specific neighborhoods, some previously indifferent gazes leaned forward. When she displayed the interviewee's statements, those phrases that pierced the heart with their simplicity, the silence deepened. "I feel like I'm always representing a place that people here don't want to see," Emily read, quoting one of the lines. "When people ask me where I come from, I think twice before answering because I know they'll imagine things about my family, my neighborhood that aren't true." She paused, allowing the words to resonate. Upon reaching the final part, the proposal for the mentoring program and ongoing support, I knew I would face resistance, but I also knew that this was where the greatest strength of the work lay. She spoke about costs, implementation phases, and how small, structured changes could generate lasting impact. Finally, she concluded, "If we continue to measure success solely by enrollment numbers, we will be ignoring an essential part of reality. For many students, getting in isn't the problem. Staying is. And that's a responsibility that the university and the state need to share." There was a heavy silence when the last slide appeared, with the phrase, "Those who are almost never heard are still waiting for an answer." Emily closed her notebook, took a deep breath, and said, "Thanks." The applause came, timid at first, then firmer. It wasn't thunderous, but it was respectful. She began to move away from the podium when the Master of Ceremonies spoke. "Thank you, Professor Carter. We will now open the floor for questions from the committee." One of the advisors raised his hand and asked about the time needed to see results. Another asked about possible partnerships with nonprofit organizations. Emily answered confidently, thanking everyone for their question. She felt that the conversation here was different from the one she had had earlier in her own department. There were criticisms, yes, but there was also a genuine interest in understanding what she was proposing. When the question and answer session ended, the Master of Ceremonies announced a short break before the committee's internal meeting. People stood up, began chatting in small groups. Some approached Emily to congratulate her or ask quick questions. It was at that moment that the back door of the auditorium opened with a slight. Many were already standing, chatting, some walking towards the exit. Almost no one paid attention when the tall figure, in a dark suit and blue tie, entered accompanied by two aides. Only when he began to walk down the central aisle did some notice and fall silent. Education Minister Robert Whitfield was no stranger to the audience. His face had graced magazine covers, national television interviews, and heated debates about funding and educational. Seeing him there, walking directly into the auditorium, caused several attendees to straighten their posture. Emily, who was collecting the papers on the podium, didn't immediately understand what was happening. She thought he was just leaving to answer a phone call or going to another meeting. But then he didn't head for the exit. Instead, he walked resolutely toward the stage. A murmur arose. Some people whispered, "It's him, ... double," quote, someone murmured. "The minister," whispered another voice. In the middle row, Harris, Miller, and Klein interrupted their conversation and watched the movement with intrigue. No one imagined that this man, who rarely left his usual circle of meetings and speeches, would do anything more than listen from a distance to what the university had to say. Robert Whitfield climbed the 2 steps onto the stage with the composure of someone accustomed to being watched. He approached Emily, who, perplexed, still clutched the blue folder to her chest, and extended his hand. "Professor Carter?" he asked, his voice firm but cordial. She blinked as if she needed a second to believe that this was really happening. Yes, it's me." He held her hand firmly. "I needed to speak with you personally," the minister said. "I've already read a report on your research, but hearing the presentation convinced me even more." He glanced briefly at the audience, which was now almost completely silent. "We need you in a closed meeting this afternoon, if possible. I want to discuss how we can turn this proposal into a state-level pilot project." The silence grew even thicker. Someone in the audience dropped a pen. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Harris, his eyes wide, leaned forward as if to make sure he had heard correctly. Miller put his hand to his mouth in surprise. Klein couldn't hide his astonishment. Whitfield continued, "What you've shown here isn't just good academic research. It's a roadmap to something we've been searching for quite some time, even if we couldn't quite put our finger on it." He gestured with his other hand, indicating the faded slides behind it. "The way you connected data, real stories, and concrete proposals, that's exactly what's missing in many of our decisions." Emily felt her face flush, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment, but rather from a mixture of disbelief and relief. I thank you very much, sir. It would be an honor to participate in this meeting." "Excellent," he smiled briefly. "My team will coordinate the schedules with the university administration, but I wanted to assure you, in front of you and everyone here, that what you did today won't just remain theoretical." He turned to the audience. "You have here a researcher whose work deserves not only applause, but also the opportunity to be put into practice." There was a murmur of surprise among those present. Some began to clap spontaneously. It was no longer formal applause. There was genuine enthusiasm there. The sound grew, filling the entire auditorium. Emily, still unsure where to place her hands, smiled in a restrained, almost shy way, but her eyes shone. In the middle row, Harris clapped as well, a little later than the others. He looked at the stage with an expression difficult to decipher: surprise, perhaps a trace of wounded pride, but also something reminiscent of respect. Miller stared at the floor for a few seconds before joining in the applause. Klein let out an almost imperceptible sigh, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw a genuine, albeit brief, smile on his face. When the minister stepped down from the stage, followed by his aide, several people approached Emily. A school principal asked to speak with her about potential partners. A journalist inquired if she could interview her briefly before the end of the afternoon. A representative from a private foundation left a card, saying they would love to discuss funding for mentoring programs. It was as if, in a few minutes, her position in that environment had changed abruptly. Just a short time before, she had been seen as the idealistic young woman who was perhaps going too fast. Now, she was someone whose name the minister had publicly mentioned, someone he had asked to see in person, someone who had suddenly become indispensable in a high-level conversation. Later, back at the department, Emily entered the faculty room with hesitant steps. The news had spread quickly. Even those who hadn't been in the auditorium already knew that the minister had interrupted protocol and gone up on stage to speak with her. Harris stood near the window pretending to observe the activity on campus. Miller shuffled some papers on the table, and Klein put books away on a shelf. When Emily entered, there was an immediate silence. For a few seconds, no one knew exactly how to react. She thought about walking straight to her desk, turning on her laptop, and burying herself in work, pretending not to notice the tension. But before she could do that, Harris turned and said, Professor Carter. She paused, unsure whether to smile or maintain a neutral expression. Try? He cleared his throat, crossed and uncrossed his arms, like someone who isn't used to admitting he was wrong. I heard that the minister was quite impressed. Emily hesitated. He was very kind. He mentioned a possible pilot project. Yes, I know. Harris stared at her for a moment. I wanted to say that. Maybe I was too harsh earlier. Experience sometimes makes us cynical, but that's no excuse to belittle someone. Your presentation was strong and apparently necessary. Miller looked up from his papers. He went up on stage in front of everyone, she said, half incredulous. I've never seen that happen before. Usually, they leave with a cold wave and send an email days later. Klein added, You achieved something that many of us have been trying to do years. He shrugged. You can't say it was just marketing or a fad. Emily felt the weight of the past few months ease a little. The words weren't perfect. They didn't erase the irony, but there was a recognition there that, until then, it seemed impossible. She gave a small smile. Thank you. But this isn't about me. It's about the students who are still fighting to be seen. Of course it's about them, Harris said. But today, whether you like it or not, it's also about you. He offered a tired smile. And perhaps it's time for us old folks to learn to listen more to the young people. That conversation didn't erase all the differences, nor did it suddenly transform the department into a harmonious place. There would still be heated debates, resistance to change, bureaucracy, and slowness. But something had changed, albeit subtly. The easy laughter at the expense of the young professor no longer seemed so easy. In the following days, Emily's schedule became packed. There were meetings with school representatives, long video calls with the minister's team, and encounters with students who wanted to learn more about the project and offer help, the time she previously had to spend walking alone around campus, coffee in hand, and heavy thoughts in her head, was now filled with conversations, planning, and decisions that could alter the path of many people. She also continued attending classes, listening to stories like Ashley, Michael's, and so many others who didn't appear in the news, but carried the weight of the system on their shoulders. Each new conversation reinforced her certainty that what had begun as a doctoral thesis had become something bigger than herself. On a cold afternoon, weeks later, Emily walked down the same hallway where, months before, she had entered insecure and silent. Now some students greeted her by name, others approached to ask about the project. On the department's bulletin board, a poster announced a new student mentoring initiative, titled The Invisible Voice Pilot Program. Applications open. She paused before the poster, letting her eyes scan each line. There, printed in smaller letters, was the text, Developed in collaboration, Ashmont University and the State Department of Education. At the bottom, a group photo showed state representatives, school principals, and some teachers. She was there, in the right corner, smiling a little awkward, as if she hadn't yet gotten used to being photographed in situations. Next to her, someone had discreetly pasted a small handwritten note written by some student. Thank you for remembering us. Emily smiled again, this time without restraint. She thought about how many times back in the beginning they had laughed at her for being too young, too idealistic, too daring. She thought about how many meetings she had left feeling like a child trying to speak at a table full of adults. But he also remembered the moment the minister entered the auditorium, interrupting the silent logic of those who believed that nothing truly new could come from someone like the memory of seeing him walk towards the stage, asking for her in front of everyone still seemed surreal. However, stronger than the image of the minister was the idea that had made him rise from his chair, the conviction that those invisible voices finally deserved to be taken seriously. As she turned to leave, Emily crossed paths with Harris in the hallway. He was carrying a stack of books as usual, but he stopped when he saw her. "Are you going to the meeting with the project team?" he asked. "Yes, I am. Let's discuss expanding to 2 more cities. I imagine there are plenty of challenges," he sighed. "If you need someone to review the impact data, I can help. I have some experience in that after all." She raised her eyebrows in surprise, but didn't stop smiling. "I would greatly appreciate it. It will be good to have another perspective." "Well," he said, adjusting the books in his arms. Maybe it's time for me to learn some new things too. It's never too late, right? Never, she replied. They walked together down the corridor in silence for a few seconds. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, drawing golden streaks on the waxed floor. Outside, students walked, laughed, and made plans for the future. Many of them, unknowingly, would benefit from decisions being made at that very moment, in the shadow of research that had once been the subject of ridicule. Later, after leaving a long meeting, with night already falling over the campus, Emily walked to a bench near the central square. She sat down, adjusted her scarf, and felt the cold touch her face. The surrounding buildings were illuminated, and the lit windows seemed like small squares of stories unfolding simultaneously. She thought of her mother in Ohio, who would call her whenever she saw a news story about education on television and proudly ask if she had anything to do with this. She thought of the teachers who had once laughed at her and who now listened attentively. Above all, she thought of the students who had not yet arrived, those in small-town public school, looking at the world through the same narrow windows that had once been hers. There was a lot of work ahead. There would be tiring meetings, budget cuts, veiled resistance. Not everything the minister had promised would materialize as quickly as she would have liked, but something had already changed irreversibly. The voice that had previously been ignored was now being heard in the rooms where decisions were made. And even though they had laughed at her at first, in that auditorium, in that department, in that academic world accustomed to respecting only gray hair and long resumes, the fact was that the moment the door opened and the minister entered specifically asking for her, the laughter lost its power. Because from then on, it was no longer just the young professor who was speaking. It was someone who brought in her own story and in her data the presence of thousands of invisible students who were finally beginning to be seen. Emily stood up from the bench, took a deep breath, and resumed walking toward the department building. The steps were the same, the corridors were the same, but the weight she carried was no longer that of wondering if she belonged there. Now, the weight was different. The knowledge that, yes, she did belong, and that, precisely for that reason, she had the responsibility to continue speaking, even when others preferred the comfort of silence, and she was willing to bear that weight, because deep down she knew that as long as there was someone who still felt invisible within those walls, her work would not be finished. And it was precisely this certainty that kept her going, ahead, one step after another, in a university that, little by little, began to listen more seriously to the voices that had been ignored for so long.